In this video, we're going to be showing off all the different concepts we've talked about with the machine sequencer and showing how to use them in context of making a quick beat. This video will showcase some of the ideas and show you how they could potentially be used in your machine workflow. So let's first start off with the drum pattern. If you look at what I have right now, I have 3 different groups loaded up. I have a drum pattern, a flute lead sound, and then an 808 bass line. So let's go ahead and sequence up a quick drum pattern. So switch over to the pad modes, and it just sounds like this. And I'll be using these 2 samples, this kick and snare, and then also this hi-hat. So what we'll do for this pattern is first sequence on the step sequencer the kick and snare, and then we're going to use the random mode on the variation section to create a hi-hat pattern. Let's first start off with our kick drum. Switch over to the pattern mode and make sure that fixed velocity is turned on. We'll put a kick at the beginning of our bar, kick at the end of the bar, and then just right about here, somewhere in between in the middle. And then we'll switch over and grab our snare sound. And then because we're at a faster BPM, we're at 151 is the BPM that I have this project set to. We're going to do more of like a halftime beat to make more of a hip hop style beat. So let's sequence the snare drum on the second half of our bar so that things don't feel too fast. And that just sounds like this. And then we can go and extend out our pattern. And then let's do something similar for the second half of our bar. So let's grab our kick, put a kick on the beginning of the bar, switch over, kick on the beginning of the bar, and we'll do one right in the middle. Now let's just mirror the snare pattern from the beginning. So grab the snare, put it right there. That sounds like this. So we have a simple groove going, but now we can add in a hi-hat to our pattern. So switch over to our hi-hat. Then we're going to be using the variation mode to create a fast, random hi-hat pattern with a little bit of shuffle to go on top of our kick and snare pattern. So switch over to the variation mode, set the step length to 1, put the probability to, let's do about 70 will work fine. And leave the high point at 100 and then move this down to 90. So that we don't have too much velocity variation going. And then we just want to move things slightly in and out of time, so just put that in amount of 5%. So now whenever I hit the apply button, let's just do that until we see a pattern that we like. We could do a pattern like this one, and it sounds like this. So another thing too, if we look at our step sequencer, we don't have too much velocity variation going, and it may be nice to add a little bit more shuffle through a velocity curve that's moving a little bit more. So let's move back to the variation mode, and make sure actually before you do that the hi-hat's selected. Then we're going to change it over to the humanized mode, with the time shift at 0, because we don't want to mess with the timing of everything. And then we can put the velocity range down to about 75, and then hit apply. So now if we look at our step sequencer, you can see that there's a lot more velocity variation for a hi-hat pattern. This will give it a little bit more shuffle. So now let's just add in one more note to the end of our sequence. There's a clap sound on this kit that I want to add, just a little clap fill at the very end. So let's select the clap, and then let's go to our step mode and make sure that you're set to the second half of everything. And then we can add in 2 claps just like that. And that sounds like this. Then we can also move into our mixer and turn down the volume of that clap as well, because it's a little bit loud. Now we can move on to our next sound that's a little bit more of a lead sound. It's this flute patch that sounds like this. Then we can randomly generate a melody with this patch to get an idea started. Let's first make sure that our key is set to G major. So move over to the keyboard mode. Make sure that it's set to major. And then make sure that your root note is set to G. And if you see this as a different note, let's say for example it's A1, you can just use these semitone controls to move that down. So make sure it's set to G, and then we can move over to the variation mode, and then go to the random mode, and then we can get a pattern started. So for this lead pattern, let's go ahead and put our velocity settings to the same across the board. So just 100 on each of the velocity settings so that we don't have any variation. Make sure the note count is at 1, the step is at 1, and then we'll have it go from G3 to G4. So just one octave in the key that we're working in. We can leave the probability at something about 70%, and then we'll see what that gets us, and then we can kind of adjust from there. So just hit the apply button until you get something that looks like a melody that may be interesting. I feel like this one may be interesting. We could work with this one because it's got this ascending and descending pattern that could be good. So let's just hear what that sounds like. So this pattern has some interesting moments going on in it, so we can use this one. So let's switch over to our step sequencer. I'm going to make a few adjustments. There's quite a bit of notes going on here, so I'm actually going to remove these notes towards the end. Let's say this one, so hit Shift and clear, and maybe remove this last note too. And we can see what that sounds like. And I'm actually going to remove this note right here as well. And we can actually shift this note over slightly. It's a pattern that I'm hearing. Let's just use the nudge feature. Then we can also extend out our pattern length as well to 2 bars. So the next thing that we want to do here is double check and make sure that our melody is properly in key, because it is randomly generating these notes. So sometimes it'll make notes that are out of our project's key. So let's go to the very beginning. We'll see that it's a B note. Switch over to our keyboard view. And we'll see that B is in the scale we're working in. So that first note's okay. Move it over to a D. And the D note is in the scale that we're working in, so that's okay to use. And then we have an E note, which is in our scale, so that one's okay too. Then we have an F sharp, which is also in our scale. Then it descends down to another B note, and then to another D. So we've double checked, and all the notes that we have in our scale are in key with our project. So that so far just sounds like this. And it may be cool too to extend out this last note just to add a bit more variation. And then next we can add in an 808 bass line. So this patch just sounds like this. And for this patch, you want to make sure that you're on headphones or a speaker system. You can hear the sub bass because it'll make it a bit easier to hear. Although if you are on a laptop, you could still follow along because the top end of the sound does have a little bit of distortion. You could still hear it on laptop speakers. And this is just one of the preset 808s for Massive. So now what we're going to do here is use the variation mode to create a random 808 bass line to go with our project, just to kind of get ideas started to create more interesting patterns. Because I find whenever I start sequencing 808s a lot of times, I tend to do the same thing over and over. But whenever I do things this way, it can add a bit more variation that I might not have thought of. It makes more interesting patterns. Let's move over to the variation mode. Make sure it's on the random tab here and leave the velocity settings where they're at. We can actually turn this step length to 6 because we want a longer pattern because these are 808s. We don't want it hitting on every single note. And then let's bring this probability down to something like 30%. So it doesn't create notes on every single pattern. And then we'll just keep hitting the apply button until we get a pattern that looks kind of like an 808 bass line. So I think that this pattern is interesting. We have this root note and then it jumps down to this note in this lower octave and then jumps up, and then jumps down again and then jumps up. So this should sound interesting. And right now this clip will be too high up in its octave. So let's drop that down a few octaves. So switch over to the events mode, go to the select settings, hit all, and then we're going to hit shift and octave minus a few times. That just sounds like this. Now what let's do too is extend out our pattern to 2 bars. It's a little bit longer in length. Then we can kind of start shifting these notes around. So I like what's going on here, but let's go in and push this note over slightly. Elongate this pattern to make it half time. So far that sounds like this. Then perhaps we could even go in and remove this note here. And then we can shorten this section up too. And I'm actually going to extend this out so that it lasts for half of this first bar. And then let's copy over this note and add one more in. So just hit Shift, copy and paste. And then we'll shift that up 5 semitones, and then we'll nudge that over a few times. And then we'll elongate that note. So far our pattern sounds like this. And then let's raise this up an octave too, because everything's a little bit low. So let's move to the events mode. So in the events mode, make sure that all is selected. And then hit Shift and octave plus. And then now that we kind of have a basic 808 pattern going, we can go in and adjust the actual note values. So let's go to our first note. And if we move over to the step sequencer, it'll be a little bit easier to see everything. Now let's make sure that the pitch of this note, this first note, is set to a G, because that's the key of our project. Could even drop that down a full octave. Now let's go to the second note, make sure that it's at a G. And then we'll double check. Let's see, this is an A, which I believe is in our scale. Yep, that's right. So that A is fine. And jumps up to an E, which is also in our scale. And then it jumps back down to a G, and then to this D. And maybe we'll drop that down just a little bit, maybe to something like a B. Now let's check the notes that we have in our scale. We see that we have A, so actually let's try that out. See how that sounds. So that note sounds a little bit better once we drop it down to something that's a bit lower. And then that completes our simple 808 pattern that we've created. So if this was a full song project that you're working on, you'd want to go in and continue to adjust things and elongate sections out and create various different variations. But this video just kind of shows you all these ways that these different sequencing techniques can be used in your machine projects. So you could use them to create interesting 808 patterns like what we did that you may not have thought of whenever you just go in and sequence notes or play them in. It could be a great way to get out of different creative blocks you have because you can use these pattern generators to create new ideas and new variations so you don't keep creating the same thing over and over. And then you can also use it for things like rhythmic variation like what we did with the hi-hat patterns in the step sequencer. So it's a great way to get really fast and intricate hi-hat patterns, but without having to go in and individually sequence everything and then individually adjust the shuffle of each of the notes. So that completes our course on advanced note sequencing with the Machine Mark III controller. I hope you enjoy the video course. I make sure to check out all the other courses on Groove 3's website to continue learning about the Machine platform, as well as all sorts of different audio softwares and plugins. Thanks, and I hope to see you in another course soon.